For 17 years of marriage, Graham Whitmore told his wife that her paintings were fit for nothing more than covering the cracks in a plaster wall. In the divorce filing he drew up himself, he asked the court to value the entire collection of what he called soiled canvas and wasted paint at exactly $1, a figure he considered almost generous. He believed it completely, and he wanted the world to believe it too, the same way he wanted every jury he had ever faced to believe whatever version of the truth served him best. But only 3 days before the final hearing that would end his marriage, the art world convulsed with a single unprecedented sale, and an unknown painting, signed with the name Zariah Ellington, sold for $48 million. Graham had laughed for years at the woman he was leaving. Now he sat frozen in front of a screen at 2 in the morning, watching the number refresh again and again, realizing far too late that he had thrown away the one person the entire world was suddenly desperate to find. The marriage had always looked, from the outside, like something worth envying, the kind of union that appeared in the society pages of magazines nobody admitted to reading. Graham Whitmore was a corporate attorney with a name partners fought to put on the letterhead of every major filing, a man who billed by the hour and measured his own worth in the same relentless, unforgiving units. Zariah Ellington had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design before family obligations pulled her home in her early 20s, and she had spent nearly 18 years afterward painting in the attic of the brownstone they shared on the Upper East Side, a converted space with slanted ceilings and tall north-facing windows that caught the gray autumn light exactly the way she liked it, soft and even and without shadow. She was quiet by nature, the kind of quiet that unsettled people who mistook silence for emptiness, and she believed, stubbornly and without apology, that real art did not need to shout in order to be understood. It only needed the right eyes to eventually find it, and she was willing to wait as long as that required. She had left Rhode Island in her final year, not because her talent had faltered, but because her father had fallen ill that winter, and someone needed to manage the family accounts while her 2 brothers finished their own degrees elsewhere. She had promised herself, packing her supplies into the back of a borrowed car, that the pause was temporary, a single semester at most, a small delay, before she returned to finish what she had started. The semester became a year, and the year became a marriage. And somewhere in the middle of building a household with a man who billed by the hour, the promise to herself quietly slipped beneath everything else she was required to manage. She never resented her father for it, and she rarely spoke of that unfinished chapter at all. But it remained folded somewhere inside her, a private ache she carried into every canvas she touched for the next 18 years. Graham never found her worth looking for, and he made very little effort to hide it. He filled the walls of their home with works by artists whose names appeared regularly in glossy auction catalogs, sleek abstract pieces, and mid-century prints. He bought not because they moved him in any real way, but because they signaled, to every guest who walked through the door, exactly how much money he had spent, and exactly how little he had needed to think about spending it. Zariah's canvases stayed upstairs, stacked 3 and 4 deep against the sloped walls of the attic, layered in dust and dried turpentine, and the particular loneliness of being unseen for years at a stretch. When friends visited for dinner parties, Graham would sometimes mention his wife's painting almost as an afterthought, gesturing vaguely toward the ceiling as though the attic were a harmless hobby room rather than the place where she poured everything she had left after each disappointing day. The guests would smile politely and change the subject. Some would laugh outright, assuming it was meant as a joke, and Graham never once corrected them. At one dinner, a colleague from his firm named Preston Hale asked, half serious, whether the attic paintings were the reason the ceiling upstairs had needed repair the previous spring, and the whole table erupted into laughter loud enough to carry up the staircase. Zariah had been standing at the top of the stairs at that exact moment, a stack of clean napkins in her hands, and she simply turned around, walked back into the kitchen, and finished setting the dessert plates without a word to anyone. Graham never noticed she had heard it. He rarely noticed much of anything that happened above the second floor of that house. Vanessa Doyle, long before she became anything more than a colleague's occasional dinner companion, once asked to see the work for herself, curious in the mildly performative way of someone who wanted to appear cultured at a party. Graham waved her off with a single sentence that Zariah would hear repeated, in one form or another, for almost 2 decades of marriage. "Paint doesn't pay mortgages," he would say, usually right after writing a check for another artist's work, usually pitched loud enough for her to hear it clearly from the next room. He said it the year she turned 30, standing in the doorway of the attic with his coat still on. He said it again, the year she turned 35, at a dinner where she had quietly excused herself before dessert. He said it on the night before their 16th anniversary, standing in the kitchen with his tie already loosened and a tumbler of scotch in his hand, certain that the words carried no more weight than a passing comment on the weather outside. Zariah never answered him, not once, not in 17 years. She never raised her voice, never slammed a door, never once tried to explain what the work meant to her in language he might have been able to hear, because she had learned, slowly and at great personal cost, that some people cannot be argued into seeing what they have already decided is invisible. She simply climbed the narrow stairs each night after the house had gone quiet, and closed the attic door behind her, and she kept painting, because the canvas never once told her that her hands were wasting time, and the brush never once looked at her the way her husband did across a dinner table. By the final autumn of their marriage, the distance between them had become a permanent fixture of the house, as unremarkable and load-bearing as the furniture, something everyone in the family had simply learned to walk around. By that last autumn, Graham had already begun seeing Vanessa Doyle in earnest, an art curator whose sharp elegance and easy, practiced confidence made her, in his mind, everything his wife was not. Vanessa found Zariah's quietness pitiable rather than mysterious, and she said so, more than once, in the careless way people speak about someone they are certain will never hear them. Graham stopped coming home for dinner most nights. He stopped asking what Zariah had been working on upstairs, stopped asking anything at all beyond logistics involving the housekeeper or the accountant. And on a wet October evening, with rain tapping steadily against the tall windows of his downtown office and the city lights blurring gold through the glass, he had his assistant print the paperwork that would end their marriage, confident and unhurried, walking away from a woman he was certain had nothing of real value left to lose. The divorce filing itself became a quiet cruelty, dressed up in the language of legal precision, the kind of document only a man who had spent his career writing them could construct without a flicker of guilt. Graham's attorneys drafted a settlement that claimed nearly everything he considered worth claiming: the penthouse on the Upper East Side, the joint investment accounts accumulated over 2 decades, the vintage cars kept in climate-controlled storage upstate, the retirement funds that had grown fat and comfortable through years of corporate billing. In exchange, he offered a single, almost theatrical concession, one he clearly believed cost him nothing at all and might even make him look magnanimous in front of a judge. The paintings, he told his lawyers, all of them, every last canvas stacked in that attic, would go to Zariah. No contest, no argument. It was meant as a small, dismissive kindness, the way a man might let his estranged wife keep a chipped coffee mug from a wedding registry, because he genuinely did not care who ended up with it. His legal team, following his instructions to the letter without a second thought, listed the entire collection under a single flat-line item buried deep in the settlement documents. Estimated value, the paperwork read plainly: $1. Graham read the figure over dinner with Vanessa that same week and laughed, swirling wine in his glass under the restaurant's low golden light, remarking that it was almost generous of him to round up from nothing at all. Vanessa laughed with him, calling it the kindest lie he had ever told inside a courtroom, and neither of them noticed that somewhere across the city, in a small, tired law office with dim overhead lighting, Zariah was reading the exact same page without a single flicker of protest crossing her face. She signed it without hesitation. She did not argue the valuation, did not request an independent appraisal, did not ask her own attorney, a sharp but weary woman named Renata Cole, to fight for a single additional cent on her behalf. Renata pressed her gently, more than once, asking if she truly understood what she was giving up and what she was accepting in return by signing so quickly. Zariah only nodded and said, in the same steady voice she used for everything, that the paintings were the only thing she had ever really wanted from that marriage, and that Graham could keep the rest of it, all the marble countertops and imported furniture and country club memberships that had never once made her feel like she belonged inside her own home. That night, after the papers were filed and the apartment had gone completely silent around her, she climbed the attic stairs one final time, as a married woman, and stood in front of an unfinished canvas she had been circling for months, unable to find its ending. She picked up her brush before midnight and did not put it down again until dawn had begun to bleed pale gray light through the tall windows. She called the finished work the last silence, and she did not show it to anyone, not even herself, not for weeks. The visit that changed everything arrived without warning, on an ordinary gray afternoon almost a month after the divorce papers had been signed and filed away in triplicate. Professor Adrian Solomon, one of the few instructors from her years at Rhode Island who had ever taken her seriously as a student rather than a curiosity, reached out simply to check on someone he remembered fondly, entirely unaware of the divorce or the attic, now full of nearly 2 decades of unseen work. Zariah let him up out of habit more than genuine enthusiasm, expecting a brief, polite conversation about nothing in particular over tea. Instead, he stopped completely in the doorway of the attic and went still, his eyes moving slowly across canvas after canvas leaning against the sloped walls, and for nearly a full minute he said absolutely nothing at all, which for a man who had spent 40 years teaching and talking endlessly about art was its own kind of quiet confession. He urged her, with an intensity she had not seen in him for years, to bring the work to a private showing somewhere, insisting that what she had built in that attic did not belong hidden any longer behind dust and silence and other people's indifference. Zariah refused, gently but firmly, telling him that she had stopped painting for an audience a long time ago and that she was not interested in being discovered by people who had spent nearly 2 decades looking straight through her without ever once stopping to look again. Adrian did not argue with her directly, understanding that pressure had never worked on her before and would not start working now. He simply asked, before he left that afternoon, whether he might photograph a few pieces for his own private archive, a request so modest and familiar that Zariah agreed without much thought at all. Adrian drove home that evening, replaying the visit in his mind, unable to shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something the rest of the world had somehow missed for nearly 2 decades, and he found himself thinking of every student he had ever taught who possessed real talent but lacked either the confidence or the circumstance to keep pursuing it. What she did not know was that those photographs would leave the attic and travel further than she could have imagined, landing eventually in the private collection folder of a man named Malcolm Laurent, a French Beninese billionaire, whose eye for contemporary art was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones across 3 continents, and in every serious auction house from London to Hong Kong. Malcolm had built his fortune in shipping decades earlier, but his real reputation had grown from a smaller, quieter habit a pattern collectors and dealers had noticed over the course of 30 years of buying almost exclusively from artists no one else had discovered yet. He had purchased early canvases from painters who were later celebrated in major retrospectives, always before their names meant anything to the wider market. And he had developed, in the process, an instinct that curators privately admitted they could not fully explain or replicate. He did not chase trends. He chased something harder to name, a feeling he described once, in a rare interview, as the sense that a painting was still waiting for someone to finish listening to it. Malcolm did not respond the way most collectors did, with a polite inquiry or a request for higher resolution images. He booked a flight to New York within 48 hours of first seeing the photographs, telling his assistant only that he needed to see the originals in person before anyone else in the world had the chance to. When he arrived at the attic, dressed simply in a dark wool coat, without the entourage or ceremony most people expected of a man with his fortune, he stood in front of the last silence for nearly 20 minutes without saying a single word. Zariah, uncomfortable under the sheer weight of his attention, finally asked what exactly he was looking for. Malcolm turned to her with an expression she had never once seen on Graham's face. In 17 years of marriage, something suspended between reverence and recognition, and he asked her a single question that would echo through everything that followed in the months ahead. Why? He wanted to know, had she stopped believing that people would ever be capable of understanding what she was making? Zariah told him, eventually, in a voice quieter than usual, that belief had never really been the problem. It was patience she had run out of. The particular exhaustion of explaining a language no one around her had ever bothered learning. And somewhere along the way she had simply decided it was easier to paint only for herself than to keep translating her work into terms someone like Graham might finally accept. Malcolm listened without interrupting, nodding slowly, and told her that the best work he had ever collected in 3 decades had almost always come from exactly that kind of exhaustion, from artists who had stopped performing for an audience and started making something true only because they no longer expected anyone to be watching. Zariah did not have a fully formed answer for him beyond that, and to his credit, Malcolm did not press her for one. Instead, he stayed for hours that afternoon, asking about her process, her years at Rhode Island, the choices behind certain compositions and color decisions, listening with the kind of focused, patient attention she had almost forgotten men were even capable of giving her. Before he left, he purchased one painting outright, refusing to negotiate the price and insisting the exact figure remain confidential between them, a detail that would only deepen the mystery once the story eventually broke into public view. He told her, as he was leaving through the narrow attic doorway, that he intended to introduce her to Eleanor Bishop, a woman who represented one of the most respected international auction houses in the world, and that Eleanor would absolutely want to see everything the attic still contained. What followed over the next several weeks felt, to Zariah, like watching her own quiet life happen suddenly to someone else entirely. Eleanor Bishop arrived with a small team of specialists who treated the paintings with the careful reverence usually reserved for centuries-old masterworks, examining the layering of pigment beneath bright portable lights, the texture and weave of the canvas, the chronology of her technique across nearly 2 decades of unseen and undocumented labor. They cross-referenced dates against old gallery inquiry letters and academic transcripts from Rhode Island, patiently verifying that the woman standing quietly in the corner of her own attic really had built this entire body of work alone, without gallery representation, without critical attention, without a single sale of any real consequence in 18 years of continuous work. One specialist, an older man with silver hair and a clipped, formal manner, stood back after hours of careful analysis and said, almost to himself but loud enough for the room to hear, that she was not simply a talented painter working quietly in isolation. She was building an entire movement that no one else had even noticed was already happening around them. Another member of the team, a younger conservator who had spent years authenticating mid-century works for a major museum, spent an entire afternoon photographing brushstroke patterns under raking light, comparing the layering of pigment across nearly 40 separate canvases to trace how her technique had shifted and sharpened year over year. She found something rare in the progression, an artist who had clearly never stopped evolving, despite having no gallery, no critics, and no market pushing her forward, evolving instead, for reasons that seemed to live entirely inside herself. When she finally presented her findings to Eleanor, she used a word she admitted she rarely applied to a living painter still working in obscurity. She called it lineage, the sense that Zariah's body of work already stood as a complete and coherent chapter in the larger history of American abstraction, whether or not anyone outside that attic had ever noticed it happening. The auction house made an unusual decision once the paperwork was finalized, choosing to keep the artist's identity confidential right up until the night of the sale itself. A strategy Eleanor explained was meant to let the work speak entirely for itself, free of any narrative about the painter's personal life or the recent collapse of her marriage. Word still spread regardless, the way it always does in a world built quietly on whispers and private phone calls between old friends, and within days collectors across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East had registered for the sale of an unnamed contemporary painter whose work, according to the few who had seen it in person, was unlike anything currently moving through the market. Graham, still consumed with the final details of his divorce and his upcoming wedding to Vanessa, saw headlines about a mysterious upcoming sale scrolling past on his phone one evening and paid it no attention at all, certain it had absolutely nothing to do with the quiet, unremarkable wife he was in the final stages of leaving behind. Vanessa, for her part, found the entire growing rumor mildly amusing at dinner one night, and she made a joke about it without knowing how close to home it truly was. She hoped, she said, with a light laugh, raising her wine glass toward the candlelight, that wherever Zariah's old paintings had ended up, they had at least managed to sell for $10 apiece to someone kind enough to take them off her hands. Graham laughed along with her, the sound easy and careless, the laugh of a man who genuinely believed the story of his old marriage was already closed and filed away for good, with nothing left inside it that could ever surprise him again. The auction house had sent out barely 200 invitations for that evening, and every seat inside the grand hall was filled well before the doors were formally closed. Collectors flew in from Geneva, Singapore, and São Paulo, dressed in the kind of understated, expensive fabric that signals wealth only to those trained to notice it, and museum representatives sat quietly in the third row, with notepads resting on their knees, ready to bid on behalf of institutions rather than themselves. Eleanor had briefed her team for weeks on how to handle the final lot, insisting that no image of the painting appear in any printed catalog beforehand, so that even the collectors filling that room had only ever seen a single blurred photograph passed hand to hand in private messages. The night of the auction unfolded inside that grand hall, lit with the kind of restrained, expensive lighting that made every face in the room look slightly more important than it truly was. Eleanor Bishop stood calm and composed at the podium, and announced the opening bid on the final lot of the evening at $400,000, a number that felt, within seconds, almost laughably small for what was about to happen in that room. The paddles rose quickly and without hesitation. 1 million, 5 million, 12 million, called out sharply by a collector from Hong Kong who had flown in specifically for this single unnamed painting. 20 million. The room, usually a place of quiet, controlled tension, began to buzz audibly with whispers, phones lighting up along the back rows, as journalists typed frantically to keep pace with numbers. No one in that hall had predicted seeing that night. 35 million, 40 million. The bidding slowed only slightly as it approached the final stretch. Two determined collectors locked in a silent, furious battle. Neither seemed remotely willing to lose until the final paddle rose one last time, and Eleanor's voice rang out clear and steady across the stunned hall. $48 million. The entire room rose to its feet in a wave of applause that lasted nearly a full minute, a reaction reserved for records that shattered every expectation walking through the door that evening. When the enormous screen behind the podium finally revealed the artist's name in elegant white lettering against a black background, the murmurs shifted into something closer to disbelief, because almost no one in that glittering room had ever once heard the name Zariah Ellington spoken before that exact moment. Within hours, the story was everywhere, racing across every major news outlet and art publication in the country, and somewhere in his downtown apartment, Graham Whitmore sat staring at his phone as it buzzed without pause, message after message arriving faster than he could possibly read them, his mind refusing for several long, disorienting minutes to connect the name glowing on his screen to the quiet woman he had shared a home with for 17 years of marriage. Panic set in almost immediately, and Graham did the only thing his instincts as an attorney knew how to do under pressure, which was call his own legal team before the sun had even fully risen the next morning. He wanted the divorce settlement reopened entirely. He wanted the paintings reclassified as marital property, acquired jointly during the marriage. He wanted, more than anything else in that moment, to undo the single line item his own legal team had drafted at his explicit personal instruction, the one that had valued an entire body of work at exactly $1 without a second thought. His attorneys pulled the original paperwork and reviewed it line by careful line, checking the date of the auction sale against the date the settlement had been signed, checking the transfer of ownership against the finalized divorce filing, checking every single timestamp with the meticulous caution of men who understood exactly how much money was now suddenly at stake. The documents told a story that could not be argued around no matter how many hours his team spent trying. The valuation had been submitted by Graham's own legal team, agreed to willingly in writing, and signed by both parties weeks before the painting had ever left the attic, let alone entered an auction house catalog. The transfer of ownership predated the sale by nearly a month. Nothing in the entire timeline suggested fraud or concealment on Zariah's part, only a husband who had been so completely certain of his wife's worthlessness that he had put it in writing, notarized and filed formally with the court, without ever once imagining the world might eventually disagree with him so loudly and so publicly. Vanessa, watching the story unfold across every screen in the city that week, began pulling away from him almost immediately. No longer amused by the joke she had made at dinner only weeks earlier, deeply uncomfortable at the sudden realization that the man she had chosen to build a future with might not be quite as untouchable as she had once believed him to be. Graham, meanwhile, spent 3 sleepless nights drafting and redrafting a motion he knew, even as he wrote it, had almost no chance of succeeding in front of any reasonable judge. He called old colleagues at rival firms, asking quiet, careful questions about whether a settlement could ever be unwound after the fact, simply because one party had drastically misjudged the value of what they were giving away. Every answer came back the same, delivered with the kind of professional courtesy attorneys reserve for peers they privately believe have made a catastrophic error. A signed and notarized valuation, entered willingly and without evidence of fraud, was almost impossible to reverse, no matter how staggering the numbers turned out to be afterward. Graham heard the answer 4 separate times from 4 separate people and refused to accept it until his own legal team told him plainly, in a conference room with the blinds drawn, that pursuing the motion further would only cost him more in legal fees than the case had any realistic chance of returning. Outside the courthouse steps that morning, a crowd of photographers had already gathered before dawn, their cameras aimed at the wide glass doors, waiting for a glimpse of the woman whose name had dominated every arts section in the country for the better part of a week. Vanessa arrived separately from Graham, sitting several rows behind him rather than beside him, her expression tight and unreadable beneath a pair of dark sunglasses she never once removed during the proceedings. The courtroom on the day of the final hearing was packed tighter than anyone involved had anticipated. Rows of journalists crowding the back benches alongside the usual attorneys and court clerks, all of them drawn by a story that had, within a matter of days, become impossible for anyone to ignore. Graham took the stand first, his voice carrying the practiced, well-rehearsed confidence of a man who had spent 2 decades convincing juries of far shakier claims than this one, insisting under oath that he had always supported his wife's artistic pursuits in his own way, that the low valuation had simply reflected an honest, good-faith estimate at the exact time it was made, and nothing more sinister than that. Renata Cole, calm and entirely unhurried, rose with a thick folder of evidence that told an entirely different story, one built not from speculation or bitterness, but from years of Graham's own careless, recorded words. She read aloud text messages spanning nearly a decade of the marriage, emails sent casually to friends and colleagues dismissing his wife's work as clutter, taking up space, a recorded voicemail in which he referred openly to the attic as her expensive little hobby room, and finally, the settlement document itself, the very one bearing his own confident signature beneath a single defining number, $1. The judge, an older woman with sharp, unblinking eyes and very little patience left for courtroom theatrics, looked directly at Graham and asked a question that seemed to hang in the air of that courtroom far longer than its brief wording would suggest. If he had truly believed in the value of his wife's work all along, she asked plainly, why exactly had he been the one to insist, in writing, that it was worth precisely nothing at all? Graham opened his mouth to answer and found, for perhaps the first time in his entire professional life, that he had no argument left to offer anyone in that room. The testimony that followed came from an unexpected source, as Malcolm Laurent himself took the stand at Renata's careful request, calm and unhurried, in a way that immediately shifted the entire energy of the courtroom. He spoke not about auction prices or shifting market trends, but about the paintings themselves, describing how Zariah's work carried an emotional weight he had rarely encountered in decades of serious collecting. A rawness born, he believed firmly, from years of being unseen by the very people who should have valued her most in the world. Several respected art critics who had studied her growing body of work in the days following the sale echoed his sentiment in written statements submitted directly to the court, noting that $48 million, staggering as it already was, likely represented only the beginning of her true market value, with at least 3 major international museums already reaching out privately to inquire about future acquisitions of her remaining work. Eleanor Bishop also submitted a formal statement outlining the extensive verification process her team had conducted before ever agreeing to place the painting under the auction house's name, emphasizing that no reputable institution would have staked its reputation on a single sale without months of authentication behind it. Taken together, the testimony painted a picture the courtroom could not easily dismiss of a body of work that had been quietly extraordinary for years, waiting only for the kind of attention its creator had never once received inside her own home. The judge's ruling, when it finally came late that same afternoon, left very little room for further interpretation or appeal. The divorce was granted in full, exactly as both parties had originally requested months earlier. The proceeds from the historic sale, along with any future earnings from Zariah's continuing work, remained entirely and solely her own, untouched by any last-minute claim Graham's attorneys attempted to construct in the frantic days following the auction. Ownership of every remaining painting, along with all rights to her name and her growing body of work, belonged to her alone, protected by the very settlement Graham had once believed was little more than a generous, meaningless act of charity toward a woman he no longer valued. He sat at the defense table as the ruling was read aloud, his expression hollowed out in a way none of the reporters in that packed room had ever once seen from him before, a man watching the exact mechanism of his own arrogance close firmly and permanently around him. A year passed before Zariah opened her first solo exhibition, held in a converted warehouse space in lower Manhattan, with soaring ceilings and enormous windows that let in the same pale northern light she had always preferred back in that quiet attic. Lines of visitors stretched down the block for hours before the doors even officially opened, a steady mixture of serious collectors, sharp-eyed critics, art students, and ordinary curious people who had simply followed her story from a startling headline into genuine, lasting curiosity about the work itself. Inside, the walls were arranged chronologically, beginning with small, tentative canvases she had painted in her earliest years in that attic, and ending with The Last Silence displayed alone in its own quiet room, and visitors who walked the full length of the exhibition often said afterward that it felt less like viewing a collection and more like reading 18 years of a private diary finally open to the public. Critics who had once written glowing reviews of the artists Graham used to hang on his walls now stood in front of Zariah's earliest, roughest work, admitting in print that they had spent careers looking for exactly this kind of unguarded honesty, and had simply never known where to find it. By the end of opening week, every single piece in the entire show had sold, several of her more significant paintings now valued well beyond $60 million apiece, numbers that would have seemed like pure fiction to the woman who had once painted quietly in an attic that no one in her own household ever bothered to visit. With a portion of the proceeds from that historic first show, Zariah purchased the very brownstone that had once contained that attic, the building where she had spent nearly 2 decades painting in patient isolation, while her marriage slowly dissolved around her, without her ever raising her voice once. She did not rename it, did not turn it into some polished monument to her own sudden success, choosing instead to preserve the space almost exactly as it had always been, slanted ceilings and creaking floorboards and all. In its place, she founded the Ellington Foundation for Emerging Artists, an organization built specifically for painters who had no gallery representation, no wealthy patrons, no clear path forward, beyond the quiet, stubborn hope that someone, someday, might finally take their work seriously enough to look twice. The Foundation's only real requirement for entry was a genuine story of having once been dismissed, overlooked, or told outright by someone close to them that their art would never amount to anything worth mentioning. Professor Adrian Solomon agreed to chair the first selection committee, spending long afternoons reviewing submitted portfolios from painters, sculptors, and printmakers scattered across every corner of the country, many of whom had never once shown their work outside a spare bedroom or a rented garage. The inaugural class numbered just 14 artists, each granted a full year of studio space, materials, and a stipend, generous enough to let them work without a second job pulling their attention away from the canvas. Zariah met with every one of them personally before the year began, walking through their early sketches without offering easy praise, asking instead the same question Malcolm had once asked her in that quiet attic, wanting to know exactly what had made each of them stop believing anyone would ever understand what they were trying to say. During a televised interview marking the foundation's official opening, a young reporter leaned forward and asked whether, given everything that had happened over the past year, Zariah would change anything at all about the years she had spent unseen and unheard inside her own marriage. She considered the question for a long, unhurried moment, her expression calm and entirely without bitterness, before answering in the same quiet, steady voice that had carried her through every year of dismissal without ever once breaking. "No," she said simply. "Sometimes people need to underestimate you for exactly long enough that the rest of the world finally gets the chance to see who you really are underneath it all." On the closing night of that first exhibition, Graham stood near the back of a crowded gallery, unnoticed among strangers who had waited hours simply to walk past the paintings hanging along the tall white walls. He found himself eventually standing in front of the last silence, protected now behind reinforced glass, a small brass plaque beneath it, quietly listing its record-breaking sale price of $48 million for anyone who cared to read it. No one in that crowded room recognized him. No one cared, or even briefly wondered, that he had once shared a home, a bed, and a name with the woman being celebrated on the small lighted stage at the far end of the hall. As applause rose in long, sustained waves around her, Zariah stood beneath the lights she had earned entirely on her own terms, closing the story not with revenge or bitterness or a single word aimed in his direction, but with the quiet, undeniable proof of talent that had simply waited for 18 patient years to finally be seen by the people who mattered. Malcolm attended that closing night as well, standing near the entrance, with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching an instinct he had trusted for 30 years prove itself correct one final time. He told a reporter, when asked for a brief comment on his way out, that the true story of the evening was never really about a record price or a broken marriage at all, but about how easily brilliance can be mistaken for nothing when the person standing closest to it refuses to look properly. The line was printed the next morning above a photograph of Zariah standing alone in front of her earliest canvas, and it would be quoted, in one form or another, in nearly every retrospective written about her career for years afterward. Graham left the gallery before the applause had even fully died down, slipping out through a side exit onto a street still slick from the evening's earlier rain, and he did not look back toward the lighted windows behind him. His engagement to Vanessa quietly dissolved within the year, neither of them ever fully explaining the ending to friends who asked, and he eventually left the firm that had built his name, moving to a smaller practice in a different city where no one recognized him from the headlines. He kept, for reasons he never explained to anyone, a single printed photograph of the last silence folded inside his desk drawer, the one image he had never been able to bring himself to throw away. Zariah, for her part, rarely spoke of him at all in the years that followed. Not out of bitterness, but because he had simply stopped being relevant to the only story she still cared about telling, the one that unfolded, canvas by patient canvas, entirely on her own quiet terms,